Why the Aviv Calendar? Today I was planning to continue our series in Revelation, looking at Revelation chapters 8 through 11. But I realized that we're now close to Pesach, and it's better to take a break from the study until after what Israel at this time calls the spring festival, the appointed times of Yahweh. So then after that is passed, I can then concentrate on those 3 chapters without interruption. So today I want to focus on the Aviv Calendar. Why are we, as Talmidim of Yeshua, following that calendar in preference to either the Western Gregorian calendar or the modern Hebrew calendar? So why the Aviv calendar? The answer is simple. It is the only one that is truly scriptural, dating from the time when ancient Israel were in slavery in Egypt. Sometime just before they departed, Moshe, that is Moses, was told in Shavuot, or Exodus, chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, Yahweh spoke with Moshe and Aaron in the land of Egypt. He said, "You are to begin your calendar with this month. It will be the first month of the year for you." Okay, but which month was Yahweh speaking about? Yahweh does not speak in direct words about which month, but rather he goes on to tell Moshe how Israel is to prepare to leave Egypt in haste in the morning of the 15th day of the month. Yahweh also said in verse 14, "This will be the day for you to remember and celebrate as a festival to Yahweh. From generation to generation, you are to celebrate it as a perpetual regulation." But which month were they to eat matzah, unleavened bread, for 7 days? All they knew was that they were to start eating matzah at sundown, because each new scriptural day begins at sundown. So in Shemot, Exodus chapter 23, verse 15, Moshe was told, "Keep the festival of matzah for 7 days, as I ordered you. You are to eat matzah at the determined time in the month of Aviv, for it was the month in which you left Egypt." So there we have the clue we needed to determine when exactly the new scriptural year begins. We know the month was called Aviv. But which part of the springtime was that month? There are 3 months in that spring period. To find the answer, we have to go back to the time of the 10 plagues, where we find in Shemot chapter 9, verses 31, that the flax and the barley were ruined because the barley was ripe and the flax was in bud. Now we have our final clue as to which is the right month and the right day on which to start eating matzah. So all we need to do is count back 14 days from the beginning of the 15th day, and we come to the first day of the correct month, the true beginning of the scriptural year. As all months in that Levitical era, that is, the period between Exodus and the destruction of the first temple, were exactly 28 days long, it was quite easy to determine the first day of each month. All Israel had to do was look for the first slither, the first visible slither of the waxing moon, less than an hour after sunset. That was the beginning of their new month. So when the barley crops were ripe, enough to be roasted and eaten, but not quite ripe enough to store, it would always be the first month of the new scriptural year. However, the calendar changed substantially in the days of Hezekiah. As we're told in Yeshayahu, or Isaiah, chapter 38, verse 8, where Yahweh said, "I will cause the shadow of the sundial, which has started going down, to go up backwards 10 intervals." So the sun went back 10 intervals, a distance it had already gone down. The length of the year had changed. And also, the phases of the moon changed from 28 days a month to 29.5 or 29 and a half. So now we can no longer be certain on which day we will see the first slither of the new moon. That is why we have to look both on the 29th day, or 29th evening, or the 30th evening, counting from when we saw the slither of this as the sighting of the previous month. Now, life is not as simple as Yahweh had originally intended it for his people Israel in this modern world. Now today is a special Shabbat because it is the one preceding the new Aviv Calendar cycle. Because just after sundown tomorrow evening, on the 30th of March, the first slither of the new moon should be visible in Israel. And thanks to the email service, we here in New Zealand at the other end of the earth are able to celebrate the arrival of the new scriptural year right on time. So the question must be asked, why so many people, even now, who are living in Israel and or in other parts of the world, are still following other calendars? Basically, it's because there are three diverse communities who all claim to be following the words of Scripture. They are the Rabbinical Judaism, who use the modern Hebrew calendar, Christianity, who use the Gregorian calendar, and the modern Messianic community, many of whom follow either one or other of those two calendars. All three will be celebrating different events on different days during the next month. Yet each one claims that their events and timings are correctly based on the scriptural narrative. But can they all be right? Are there many ways to recognize and celebrate the Moedim of Scripture? Are we permitted to pick and choose how we interpret Scripture? I want to consider a little more closely those three questions in relation to those three communities. Firstly, looking at Rabbinical Judaism. They became the sole remaining Jewish community after the destruction of the Second Temple. The Perishim, or Pharisees, of the Second Temple period reconstituted themselves and their community in the absence of the temple. Since then, they have been the religious backbone and support for the Jewish people throughout the 1900 years that they have spent in the Hellenistic diaspora. So what about Christianity? It is the second of the three communities, and it existed after the destruction of the Second Temple at the beginning of that second century. Being comprised mostly of Gentiles, it dominated and transformed the first century Messianic community of Yeshua. The new community embarked on a theological pathway that stood in stark contrast with the Rabbinical Judaism and the teachings of the first century emissaries who were chosen by Yeshua himself. And as we saw on Shavuot 30 CE, the Ruach HaKodesh came down and added 3,000 new Jews to that gathering on that one day. But the early church fathers made every effort to remove all traces of the Hebrew practice from their Greek-style Christian community. Then, by 325 CE, Christianity had also become the official religion of the Roman world. Progressively, it also divided into many different factions, starting with the Catholics and the Protestants and moving on from there. What about the modern Messianic community? Even the modern Messianic community re-emerged basically from the Christian church community in the 19th century and forged a new identity, which saw an increasing number of Jews and Gentiles embracing both the Christian doctrines and many aspects of Judaism. The result was a mix that was diametrically opposite from the intent of the Scriptures. In the first century Messianic community, Life started, as we saw in second chapter of Acts, as a totally Jewish community. But as the first century wore on, more and more Gentiles were brought in and aligned with the foundational 12 Talmidim of Yeshua, whom his father had actually chosen for him during his earthly ministry. But those Gentiles that came in during that period of 40 years between his resurrection or his ascension and the destruction of the temple were actually grafted into the national life of Israel. Then just 50 days after Yeshua's resurrection at Shavuot, those foundational Talmidim also received the Ruach HaKodesh when it came down as tongues of fire. The Messianic community grew to considerable number throughout those 40 years until the destruction of the Second Temple. Then it was overwhelmed by the uprising Christian church. But it has now begun to emerge again in the 19th century, and more particularly in the 20th and 21st century. It has become an independent entity, albeit not like the first century model. As I said earlier, all three communities in the 21st century world have adopted either the Hebrew or the Gregorian calendars, which do not reflect the followers of the first century, who all followed the Aviv Calendar. By 358 CE, Rabbinical Judaism, who had previously followed the Aviv Calendar, finally adopted the work of Hillel II as the base of their calendar. Rather than following the principles given by Yahweh directly to Moshe, they adopted a mathematical calendar while living in the Roman world. Hillel devised a calendar that did not rely on the sighting of the new moon at Rosh Hashanah, nor was it necessary to confirm that the barley crop had reached the Aviv state, because without direct contact with Eretz Israel, it became impossible for them to know exactly when the slither of the moon had been seen. And in Israel, of course, the barley had to be ripe. But when you're living in diverse parts of the world, it was impossible to know without the internet. The Christian community from the birth of the 2nd century adopted the Greco-Roman Julian calendar, which later transformed, of course, into the Gregorian calendar. Now, in the 21st century, the revived Messianic community has adopted either the Hillel calendar or the Gregorian calendar, instead of returning to the Aviv calendar, which we, as Talmidim of Yeshua, have always embraced. So why do we elect to stand apart from the other three communities? The answer is both simple and significant, because as Talmidim of Yeshua, we're going to have a truly meaningful relationship with Yeshua, our Master. And if we're going to do that, we need to observe the commands of Torah. Whether we're Jewish by birth or Gentile matters not. As Shaul, or Paul, said in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 19, being circumcised means nothing. Being uncircumcised means nothing. But what does mean something is keeping God's commandments. Those are powerful words that we need to consider carefully, because many people in the 21st century communities believe that the Torah is only for rabbinical Jews. Even many in the Messianic community claim that only the Jewish members of the community need to adhere to the teachings of Torah, while the Gentiles can adhere to the teachings of Yeshua as found in the Gospels and in the rest of the Brit Hadashah. But we must ask, are those claims correct? Does it really matter any more whether or not we observe Torah? Those questions need to be considered very carefully, because they directly affect our relationship with Yeshua. And we also need to ask ourselves, do we desire to set ourselves apart for Yahweh? Do we desire to obey Yeshua as our master? Do we desire to keep the weekly Shabbat and all 7 Moedim as specified in Torah? Because after all, the first three of the 7 Moedim of Yahweh were observed in accordance with the Aviv Calendar and reflect closely every event in Yeshua's last week here on earth in the year 30 CE. So why would anyone who desires to be among his Talmidim want to follow the festivals and meet on other days of the week or at other times of the year other than what was set down by Yahweh in both Torah and in the teachings of the emissaries? We in the Western world are obligated by social norms to conduct our lives in accordance with the Gregorian calendar. However, the dates of that Gregorian calendar are constantly in conflict with the desire of the way we want to live in accordance with a scripturally based Aviv calendar. But why not simply adjust our dates to comply with the social norms of the host nations? Could we, or should we, just follow the Gregorian calendar like most Christians in the world today? The answer is a resounding no, because it is only through the Aviv calendar, as given to Moshe, that we are able to recognize Yeshua for whom he really is. He is truly the Mashiach of Israel and the Mashiach expressed throughout the scriptures. As we read in Shemot, Exodus, chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, Yahweh spoke to Moshe and Aaron in that land of Egypt. He said to them, "You are to begin your calendar with this month. It will be the first month of the year for you." Yahweh himself never repealed or changed that calendar at any stage in the scriptural narrative. It is just as applicable today in the 21st century as it was for Moshe and the people of Israel there in Egypt. Moshe was also told 3 times in Shemot and Devarim, or Deuteronomy, "Keep the festival of matzah for 7 days, as I ordered you. You are to eat matzah at the time determined in the month of Aviv, for it was in the month of Aviv that you left Egypt." So are we going to remain faithful to the Aviv calendar of Scripture, or are we going to follow either one of the other two? The choice is ours. But we must remember again what Shavuot said. What means something is to keep the commandments of God. So in conclusion, I have considered 3 religious communities and their respective calendars, and we see the errors abound in all 3 communities. Each placed alongside the words of Scripture we read this morning, we see it is easy to see the sovereign plan of God is being deeply distorted by those calendars, other than the one that actually was given to Moshe. Finally, never did Scripture call for the Shabbat to be moved to Sunday. As we will consider again next Shabbat, Yeshua rode into Jerusalem on the 10th day of Aviv, which in 30 CE was a Shabbat. It was not a Sunday. Yeshua at his last Sedat Siyum, that is the Last Supper, inaugurated the new covenant which we read this morning in Jeremiah chapter 31, which he ratified that same day through the shedding of his own blood on the day of the 14th of Aviv in 30 CE. Yeshua fulfilled his own words when he said about the sign of Yonah, by laying in the tomb for a whole 3 nights and 3 days. Then he rose from the tomb late on Shabbat afternoon and ascended to the presence of his Father on Sunday, the first day of the week, which is known, of course, now as Bikurim. Sunday, the 18th day of Aviv in 30 CE. Those events occurred in complete harmony with the words of Scripture, and each fulfilled one piece of the prophetic jigsaw that had been written many centuries earlier through the words of Torah and the prophets, which is why Yeshua said that not a yud nor a stroke of the Torah would pass away until all things have been completed. All the events that were fulfilled by Yeshua are in accordance with Scripture. That is the reason why we, as Talmidim of Yeshua, observe both Yeshua's Sadat Siyum, Last Supper, separately from the traditional Pesach commanded by Torah. Reflecting on the words of Jeremiah 31 verse 32, Yahweh said, "For this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel in those days. I will put my Torah within them and write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people." Again, as we read in Yochanan or John, chapter 1, verse 1, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." That same Word that was with and was God was the Torah that was given to Moshe. That same Torah has now been written on the hearts of those who are faithful to Yeshua. It has never been replaced. It has never been abolished. It is the same Torah that Yahweh originally gave to Moshe. Therefore, during the next month, we all need to consider carefully, yet again, just how we stand in relationship to Yeshua and Scripture. Do we want to be part of the modern Messianic or rabbinic or Christian communities? Or do we want to stand apart from the crowd and be one with our Master Yeshua? All three communities, along with their calendars, have adopted the practices and timelines of Babylonian and Greek origin. All three have turned aside from the Torah of God in favor of their own communities, teachings and doctrines. So we do well to remember that just as Yahweh God used the king of Babylon to destroy the first temple and the Romans to destroy the second temple, he will also in the near future use both the forces of humanity and the forces of nature, which we'll learn about later in chapters of Revelation, to destroy the 21st century religious communities that have adopted their own teachings and practices ahead of and in place of the words of Scripture. Therefore, during the next month, we need to all reflect deeply where we stand with Yahweh. Are we striving to do His will, or are we seeking to have synchronism and ecumenicalism by building bridges between the three communities that we have considered? Shabbat Shalom.